The world is a dark, dark place. It's full of misery and suffering and injustice and some really bad men. To save the world and restore it to its proper order, we need a hero. Someone who is brave and strong enough to fight against evil. Someone fearless, someone who is determined to overcome extreme challenges against all odds. The specific conditions and methods of such overcoming may vary, but the core idea remains the same. In a typical heroic story, the usually male protagonist eventually resorts to beating the crap out of some kind of villain to protect the status quo, as that is, after all, the way of the world. This story structure isn't new. It's been formally mapped out by comparative mythologists like Vladimir Brok and Joseph Campbell. Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, became a Bible among Hollywood scriptwriters. In it, he studied myths from across the world and concluded that all these stories follow a marvelously constant narrative, the hero's journey. As Campbell puts it, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Sounds familiar, right? That's because it's essentially the plot of every action movie you've ever seen. But here's where things get interesting. After the book's publication, Campbell continued to teach at university. One day, a female student asked him, "Well, Mr. Campbell, you've been talking about the hero, but what about the women?" Campbell was startled at this unexpected question and responded, "Well, the woman is the mother of the hero. She's the goal of the hero's achieving. She's the protectress of the hero. She's this, she's that. What more do you want?" To which the student replied, "I want to be the hero." These days, the idea that women can't be heroes is pretty unpopular, to say the least. But although I wouldn't expect just a regular person to argue that women have their own mysterious womanly life purpose of caring and cleaning after their families instead of going on adventures, I also wouldn't be surprised to hear that some people still believe that. But the fact is, now we have seen a lot of female characters on screen and in books who display model heroic behavior, who fight the bad guys, save worlds, and bring on revolutions. We now have female characters who are called strong, who are not damsels in distress, who are independent and capable and can fight as well as men. We are now used to women that play more active roles in their narratives. We see more and more female characters who challenge traditional gender roles and refuse to take the path towards marriage and children. We have broken the gender mold, or so it seems, because there's a catch. I wonder if challenging traditional gender roles is enough. You see, the idea that women can't be heroes actually implies two things. First, it suggests that women can't act the way male heroes do. We can't fight, we can't overcome challenges, we can't go on adventures. Campbell himself said as much, claiming that in the whole mythological tradition, the woman is just there. All she has to do, he argued, is realize that she's the place that people are trying to get to. Well, thank you, Mr. Campbell, how illuminating. But there is a second, more insidious implication. It's not just that women can't act like men, it's that the way women already act isn't seen as heroic. It's that femininity and heroism are incompatible. In this framework, women aren't heroes because heroism itself is defined in male terms. To be a hero, you must act like a man. To be a hero, you must act like Campbell's prototypical male action protagonist, who does things. But women just are. They are locked in towers, staring at walls, looking pretty, waiting to be saved. Basically, there are gender distortions in our understanding of heroism. We are taught that killing people is heroic, but caring for people isn't. We are taught to value masculinity and traits that are traditionally perceived as masculine, like physical strength, aggression, dominance, over traits that are perceived as feminine, like empathy, patience, and care. And of course, this spills into media criticism. We think that female characters should rise to the level of men and prove that they are not like other girls, because displaying behavior that is traditionally perceived as feminine is degrading. We celebrate strong female characters as long as they punch, kick, and quip like a man. We scorn weak female characters for relying on others because we believe that we should be completely autonomous and never accept help. We should be the masters of our own destiny. I'll give you an example. On the Otomisekai subreddit, someone once asked male readers why they enjoy Asian romance fantasy comics with female protagonists. One commenter said he liked them, but criticized what he perceived to be internalized sexism in those comics because their female protagonists sometimes relied on male characters. He said these stories are different from stories meant for boys, where the main character is pretty much always the person calling the shots on their life. So, what makes a female character strong? Is it behaving like a male hero? Is it being able to fight and hurt others? Is it calling the shots on her life? Does violence equal agency? Does freedom of actions equal agency? On the one hand, strong female characters challenge gender norms by defying traditional expectations of femininity. But on the other hand, isn't celebrating female characters who exhibit masculine-coded traits as strong, while scorning those who display feminine-coded traits as weak, just another way of reinforcing the idea that femininity is inherently inferior? Can we defy traditional gender expectations without defaulting to the notion that the male hero archetype is the ideal everyone should aspire to be? Chapter 1. Heroes. So, according to Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, or the monomyth, is a universal narrative pattern that describes the transformation of an ordinary individual into a hero through a series of trials and revelations. The journey begins with the call to adventure, drawing the hero out of his mundane life into an unknown realm. Along the way, he faces challenges and receives guidance, often from a mentor or supernatural aid. Through trials, the hero gains wisdom, confronts his deepest fears, and achieves the ultimate boon, a gift or insight that benefits not only himself but also his community. The journey concludes with the hero's return to the ordinary world, where he integrates his newfound knowledge and emerges as the master of two worlds, having achieved balance between the spiritual world, the realm of transformation, and the physical world, the realm of everyday existence. This mastery grants the hero the freedom to live, freed from the fear of death or failure. This story structure is about personal growth, self-discovery, and the cyclical nature of life, but also about facing our fears about mortality. Unsurprisingly, in stories Campbell analyzes, the heroes are all male. Despite claims of universality, the hero's journey typically centers on a young man battling an evil foe to restore the world to its proper order and assert control over it. In fact, some argue that the essence of his story is his assertion of control over himself, his environment, and his world. The hero is the personification of reason in the crazy, crazy world. He has the courage to fight what is wrong. He protects the innocent and makes things right, sometimes even makes things great again. But crucially, he fights to restore order, not to change it. Of course, the hero is not like the other bad guys. We're told he's one of the good ones, a noble exception, a nice guy. He doesn't crave control, although he's destined to get it, and he doesn't seek power, although he is destined to rule. But that's fine, because we know that he won't abuse his power. He's different after all. The hero may resist his quest, but it is his destiny. By completing his journey, he gains power, glory, and, in a way, immortality, for his name will be etched into the annals of history. Because that is, after all, the way of the world. Strong, fearless men will supposedly make the world a better place. They'll fight the bad guys and save us all of us who can't fight and can't protect ourselves. The hero's journey is one of transformation and self-realization, not only for the hero but also for the society or community he serves. The hero saves his community by bestowing boons and by sharing what he learned on his journey. He's our savior, he will protect us, and naturally what follows protecting is ruling over, because, the The weak and innocent are the protector's responsibility, so naturally, he gets to decide what's best for them, because he knows, of course. And sometimes these protectors need to eliminate threats beforehand. To protect their community, of course, because naturally they have a right to defend themselves, no matter how many people they end up killing. Conveniently, this also sets up a sequel storyline, perhaps a redemption arc where the hero suffers from PTSD after taking all those lives. He had no other choice after all, but the guilt. Oh, the guilt. Poor guy. No one is surprised to learn that the hero's journey is often one of violence and slaughter. I mean, we all know, obviously, but we prefer not to dwell on it, because it's only fiction, and we'd hate to ruin all the heroic fun, wouldn't we? Besides, who cares? They're all enemies, terrorists, evil monsters, or barbaric human animals. So it's fine, killing your enemies is the necessary evil, apparently. And then we ask ourselves why there are so many wars in the world. At the end of his journey, the hero is often rewarded with a princess. The princess who has been waiting for him throughout his journey while making herself as pretty as possible, because of course, princesses must be beautiful. The princess is part of the community the hero saves with his heroism, so naturally she's part of his reward. And after all, mythology books promise us timeless tales of gods and heroes. The heroines of these timeless tales are eminently forgettable and inconsequential. They quietly spin and weave, cook and clean, embroider, bear children, heal, and make things whole, clearing the way for the hero's salvation, or at the least, not getting in the way of it. They don't do things, they don't go on journeys, they don't engage in deeds or actions worthy of story or song. They only get to engage in activity that leaves no traces whatsoever behind it. Their names fade into obscurity, their lives unmarked by legend or memory. They are the silent victims of bad men, waiting to be protected by good men. That's how these timeless tales position women, as silent, suffering victims with no real agency or control over their lives. Maria Tatar knows that popular culture has historically offered two prevailing gendered narratives: the autonomous male hero seeking self-actualization through adventure and conquest, and the patient, long-suffering, self-effacing heroine. The hero's story is one of adventure, self-improvement, and growth. The heroine's story is a good girl narrative that I talked about in my last video. It's basically a Cinderella story. A kind and beautiful girl is hardworking and virtuous, so she gets saved by a prince from the domestic drudgery, from all the troubles and unfairness of her life. She earns her reward, her salvation, a prince, by being gentle, caring, and of course, beautiful. And she becomes the hero's reward too. He gets the girl, oh how I hate that phrase, and he earns her with his heroism and his hard work on his self-improvement journey. The heroine's journey is not through space, but through time. Her journey is endurance. Some might argue that it's not really a journey at all. As Simone de Beauvoir puts it, woman is Sleeping Beauty, donkey skin, Cinderella, Snow White, the one who receives and endures. In Songs and Tales, the young man sets off to seek the woman. He fights dragons, combats giants. She is locked up in a tower, a palace, a garden, a cave, chained to a rock, captive, put to sleep. She's waiting. And of course, she's doing absolutely nothing because women apparently don't do things. They have things done to them. Joseph Campbell claimed that the hero's journey universally describes human experience, but either that's not the case, or just some people's experiences can't be considered as human. Because to go on a journey, you have to be privileged enough to be allowed to call the shots on your own life. And of course, for the longest time, women weren't allowed to do that. They were denied their sense of self, controlled first by their fathers and then by their husbands, forced to define themselves as someone's daughters, wives, or mothers. Women themselves and their experiences were told from the perspectives of men, and Simone de Beauvoir analyzes men's ideas about women in her book The Second Sex. She argues that men saw women as these mysterious beings full of grace and beauty, beings that are gentle and kind and nurturing by nature but sometimes dangerous, beings that are sometimes wonderful but radically different from man, either not fully human or ethereal, more than human, but always something different. Woman is everything he craves and everything he does not attain. She is wholly the other, and as the other, she is also other than herself, other than what is expected of her. She is a mysterious being, contradictory, both a saintly mother and a dangerous seductress, and as Campbell said, the place that people are trying to get to. When a woman realizes what her wonderful character is, she's not going to get messed up with the notion of being pseudo-male. And if you think that nobody thinks things like that anymore, you'd be pleasantly surprised to find that YouTube is full of uplifting videos by some wise individuals who have discovered the secrets of the universe and realized that women are just human. And unfortunately, those ideas about femininity weren't just ideas. They were part of a whole narrative about a woman's destiny, about the glory of her own femininity. Newspapers, books, ads, various articles by various experts told women that their path in life was the path to seek fulfillment as wives and mothers. 1,000 experts' voices applauded their femininity, their adjustment, their new maturity. All they had to do was devote their lives from earliest girlhood to finding a husband and bearing children, said Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, the book that sparked second-wave feminism in the United States. Just as de Beauvoir, Friedan analyzed femininity as a construct that is imposed on women by the patriarchy, a cage that women were trapped in and had to break free from, a comfortable concentration camp, as she called it. She argued that even though all the experts were confident that the path to marriage and motherhood was the only natural one for women, they couldn't explain why all those American housewives that supposedly had everything that women ever dreamed of felt so empty and unhappy. It was a problem with no name because nobody could figure out why this narrative of a mysterious feminine fulfillment left so many women dissatisfied. So, to second-wave feminists, femininity itself was a cage, a construct meant to keep women oppressed, a construct that women must escape to achieve true freedom, a shackle enforced by patriarchal expectations. And it's during the second wave that scholars and activists began systematically critiquing the portrayal of women in media, emphasizing stereotypes and the reduction of women to domestic or sexualized roles. Of course we got sick of the role of the hero's prize. We wanted to be the hero. We wanted to be able to imagine ourselves going on quests and great adventures. We wanted to do things that matter, that leave a trace. To see empowered women who get to do what they want on screen. We wanted to read about them in our books. We wanted to see a way out of the path to fulfillment as wives and mothers. And it definitely took a while, but eventually we got what we wanted. We have succeeded somewhat. Female characters in books and on screens have become powerful. They are badass, they can fight and defend themselves, they choose their own paths in life. They have access to their own rage, they are not afraid to express it. They are done being good girls, they are done waiting and being obedient. They are free to do what they want, free to be heroes. But the question is, at what cost? Chapter 2. Breaking the mold. We have broken the mold, or so it seems. We can finally show that we too are strong. We now have many examples of female heroes who save worlds, defeat villains, and bring on revolutions. These female characters serve as role models for strength, resilience, and independence. And this new, strong female character is a contested figure because she's both celebrated for her strength, competence, and independence, and dragged through the mud for being annoying and unlikable. Some people try to make a distinction between truly strong female characters that are strong in a good way, and those who are just a literary or cinematic cliché. Hyper-strong, the kind of character that appears more like an action figure than a real person. I am personally not interested in making any value judgments and declaring that these characters are good or bad. But what I want to do is analyze what strong female characters are celebrated for and why, and also what they are disliked for and why. And of course, I'd like to know what makes these characters possible in the first place. Just as Jane Tolmie asked when she began her essay about strong female characters in fantasy novels, what is the nature of the coin that purchases female heroism in so many contemporary fantasy novels? And one of the things that makes, or at least for a long time, made the strong female character possible is that she's just extraordinary, exceptional. Strong female characters challenge gender roles, at least in part, but to do so, they must be compared with those who don't challenge gender roles. To break the gender mold, the girl must be exceptional. Exceptional enough to catch our attention and that of the hero. She often picks the man she wants, eludes the many others, escapes rape, lives a life less ordinary. Behind her and all around her is the silent rank and file of women who do not choose, elude, or escape. She is not like other girls, she's cool, she's badass. But she doesn't exist within a system in which all women are independent, strong, feisty, and passionate. Just like with the hero who is both ordinary and somewhat superhuman, the representation of the strong heroine depends on contrast, on binary oppositions. Strong versus weak, empowered versus oppressed, enlightened versus docile, independent versus obedient. She is not like the other girls because unlike other girls, she is independent and strong-willed. She is willing to fight and, of course, she's hot. Very hot. She usually has several men lusting after her. I mean, of course, she doesn't think of herself as beautiful, no. She has no time for beauty practices. She's not the kind of girl to wear a pretty dress because dresses are uncomfortable and you can't fight in them. And when she's occasionally coerced into wearing a pretty dress, she hates it. For strong female characters, femininity is a cage, and what lies beyond that cage is freedom. For them, femininity is their ultimate weakness, the cause of their suffering. In a lot of novels that Tolmie analyzes, these heroic female protagonists have to face horrible things such as abuse, assay, and other forms of violence imposed on women by men. So to fight this violence, these heroines reject femininity. They can't allow themselves to be weak or soft. They reject femininity as docile and always waiting. Marion from Lady of the Forest says, "That is what my mother did. That is what all women do. We wait." I would rather be a man, I think. Others even wonder how women put themselves in positions subordinate to men willingly, as Tarma from By the Sword comments about a husband of a rather weak-minded woman. It's a damn good thing he was an honest and unmalicious man, because if he'd beaten her and told her she deserved it, she'd have believed him. I mean, kudos for raising awareness about domestic violence, but the framing is a bit weird. These two examples that Tolmie analyzed are from the 90s, and I feel like nowadays no one quite writes strong female characters who are that obvious in their disapproval of other women. I feel like in contemporary fantasy and YA fantasy, their not like other girlsness is usually a bit more subtle, but I think your argument still stands. The cost of female participation in adventure stories, the cost of women becoming heroes, is often femininity itself. It has to be viewed as something degrading, something docile, a self-imposed lack of agency. Just like second-wave feminists, these female characters see femininity as a cage, a shackle that they have to break free from to become strong and free. Because a woman can only be free, can only be a hero if she acts like a man. She is not allowed to engage in behavior that is coded as feminine. The strong heroine only seems equal to men because she acts like them. She is masculine, at least in her behavior. She is always angry, defiant, fights even better than men. She is strong, bold, independent, and completely autonomous. She always puts herself and her interests first. She can't control her sexual desires, she's out of touch with her emotions, and is only able to feel anger. Scholars have called this kind of character a hero in drag or a phallic girl. Both weird terms if you ask me, but whatever, you get the point. She's your typical male hero, the strong silent type and all, but in the body of a pretty girl. And it's not bad or problematic in itself. Women are allowed to engage in masculine-coded behavior. What bothers me is that we treat that behavior as empowerment. But the strong female character doesn't challenge the power hierarchy where masculinity dominates over femininity. By being exceptional and not like other girls, she only earns a higher place in the hierarchy. For some of these female characters in fantasy, being compared to their fathers is the highest praise the novel can offer them. And they are also perfect, almost superhuman. They can do everything and anything. They not only can fight, but are also competent in a multitude of different fields. They can hack, they have a PhD in physics, and they speak 20 different languages that just always came naturally to them. They don't feel uncertainty or fear, and they're never vulnerable because they have made themselves strong. They have no flaws, other than being disagreeable, of course, but that is a sign of strength. They always do things their way, even when it makes sense to listen to other people, because how can you call yourself independent if you don't call the shots on everything 100% of the time? Receiving guidance from others is not badass enough. She's perfect the way she is. She's a masculine perfection. A truly strong girl is born sassy and defiant. She already knows everything she needs about the world and people around her. She is a free-minded individual, unlike all those other women who are just silly dupes of patriarchy. But this girl is perfect. Including, of course, her looks. Strong female characters act like men, but even though they might disapprove of weak, docile women who act like Cinderella, they should look like her. As I said, they are hot. They don't spend their days making themselves pretty for men because they are empowered. They just kind of happen to be pretty, naturally. And being beautiful means being thin, young, and of course, white or just light-skinned. And as Princess Wickes argues, even if the heroine is described with a racial ambiguous term such as olive-skinned in the book as Katniss from the Hunger Games, she will still be cast as white in the adaptation. Just like not all girls are good enough to be the hero's bride or prize, because Cinderella must be white, thin, pretty, and able-bodied, not all girls have the right looks for a typical strong female character. There are exceptions, of course, for example, Pharaoh from the First Law trilogy, who is not white and not beautiful, but in my experience, such exceptions are rare. The typical strong heroine definitely doesn't subvert the idea that women must be beautiful. If anything, her natural beauty only conceals the fact that beauty is always hard work. And of course, we call these characters empowered without actually pausing to think about where their power comes from. And their power often comes from their ability to hurt others. Their power is fighting, sometimes being able to fight just well enough to be able to protect themselves, and sometimes, well, killing. They are not soft-hearted like other women. They have the guts to do the difficult thing, the necessary thing, which is again, hurting others. Do they subvert the idea that violence is the only power that counts? They don't. If anything, by celebrating them as empowered, unlike the docile, weak female characters, we only affirm that violence is the way of the world. We only agree that the strong guy is the one who gets to win. But in our case, it's a girl, so that's empowering. Besides all that, there's another interesting paradox at play, another coin that buys female heroes in popular culture. The paradox is that even though strong female characters do everything in their power to fight oppressive gender roles and overcome injustices, these characters rely on the patriarchy to exist. If we want to see women fight oppression, we need to first see them oppressed. This is one of the reasons why even in fantasy worlds that have the impossible, dragons, magic, and myth, patriarchal systems get reproduced over and over again, so that readers can experience the pleasure of seeing characters fight against those systems. We need to see them hurt. We need them to be victims. We need their world to be unjust. We need those oppressive structures. The all too familiar situations of SA, kidnapping, and other forms of violence against women keep getting reproduced over and over again, just so that we can see the individual woman rising above a system that keeps her down. For some of these strong female characters, patriarchy becomes an adventure, something that they, and like other women, get to overcome. So that's what it is. Violence against women reproduced and fought back with more violence. Because apparently it's only natural that women are abused in the first place. That's just how the world works. Women will forever suffer and be victims of bad men unless they use the very power that those bad men use against them. The power of violence. It's only natural. Women just have to learn how to fight back, how to dominate, how to be badass, unlike all those other weak women. The underlying power structure remains the same. We are basically saying that bad men were of course right all along and violence is the true power. And female empowerment apparently also has to involve violence. I think that unless we fight the very idea that the strong will always dominate the weak, we're not really subverting anything. When we celebrate strong female characters over weak and docile ones, we are accepting that binary opposition. We are basically dividing characters into two groups of strong and weak, empowered and oppressed, enlightened and docile, independent and obedient. However, divisions like that are not neutral because they always imply a hierarchy. Strong is preferred over weak, good over bad, white over black, man over woman. In traditional heroic narratives, the hero in his existence justifies this hierarchy because the hero starts as ordinary but becomes superhuman. He becomes superior to us, ordinary humans, which is why we assume that heroes are fit to rule over us, mere mortals. And so does the girl hero. She is exceptional and independent and strong, better than other girls. But those other girls, those weak female characters, deserve to be treated as complex human beings and not just dupes of patriarchy. Despite all that, there are several things I'd like to point out. First of all, obviously strong female characters really do challenge some really restrictive ideas about what women should be like. Ideas that some people still believe in. These characters break down the barriers that only allow them to walk a single path towards marriage and kids, and disrupt the myth that women can only find happiness and meaning in a romantic relationship. And even though the critique of the strong female character can be fair, it can also be full of double standards. For example, a lot of people seem to be concerned with the fact that these characters are just unlikable, as if that's what they need to be. The hyper-strong female character is basically your typical action hero, but in the body of a woman. And for some reason, nobody is concerned with male heroes being unlikable when they behave like that. We usually accept that as normal, as just the way masculinity is. Think of the strong, broody types who feel nothing about anger, and we think that's fine. But when a woman starts behaving like that, she becomes unlikable. Some people accept unlikable behavior from male characters as something normal, but feel resistance when the same behavior is displayed by female characters. The problem is not that the strong female character is annoying and unlikable, but that some male characters are just as annoying and unlikable, but we just let them be. In fact, these male characters even become edgelord icons, admired for their audacity to be unlikable and to not give a fuck about what everyone else thinks about them. But of course, women aren't supposed to be like that. Women have to be kind, gentle, caring, and self-sacrificing. Second of all, strong female characters are empowered and can be empowering to engage with as a reader or viewer. The catch is, of course, that they sometimes are empowered because they are willing to fight or hurt others, and empowered because sometimes they have to live through unspeakable experiences to become stronger. These nuances, at the very least, should give us pause when we celebrate these characters. This isn't necessarily problematic. As I argued before, we need pain in our media for the fantasy of it being soothed. Sometimes we need the conflict, the darkness, the controversy, because while they exist in a fictional story, they are manageable, safe to experience. Violent stories reduce our anxiety about the violent acts themselves. They become tame and even fun. And I myself love female fighters because I enjoy seeing them fight and succeed. Or at least I do when they are characters that are actually complex and have depth and human flaws. Reading about them is exhilarating, and it does feel empowering because sometimes I feel like they get to do what I don't get to do. They get to be angry and cruel and unapologetic for daring to pursue what they want. I live vicariously through them because they have access to the masculine coded traits that I feel like I've been denied. and depictions of female rage and violence are important and feel cathartic, because real-world gender norms often restrict women's access to their own anger. Many women report feeling constantly angry but not knowing how to express it. But we can get access to our own anger when engaging with raging fictional women. It feels very liberating to have a fictional character express all of your pent-up feelings. These characters fight the constraints of feminine identity, and that is one of the fights that we should be fighting. It is important. But when strong female characters individually violate gender norms, but do nothing to disrupt the power structures that perpetuate those norms in the first place, when they rise to the level of men and therefore the underlying hierarchy remains, to me, that's not subversive at all. Just challenging gender roles and becoming empowered through violence is not enough. What we also need is to dismantle the very hierarchy of strong over weak, and question the nature of the power that we crave so much. For example, Jude, the protagonist from The Cruel Prince, is stolen from the human world to the land of Faerie, where humans are basically despised for being weak and mortal. She and her sister are being bullied, and she hates her own powerlessness and the fact that she can't fight back against her bullies. What she craves is power, the power to become equal to Faerie, the power to stand her ground. And even though her situation remains pretty hopeless, because fairies are much more powerful than her, she does eventually get the power that she craves so much. And even though she does fight and even murder people, she's very self-aware about how she's actually driven not by her strength, but by her fear, by her desperation, by her powerlessness. She realizes that in her hungry quest for power, she's turning into the very monster she was so afraid of. Her violence and anger and everything else come from her being weak and powerless. She is empowered, but also somewhat broken in her power. Besides all that, the story compares her to her twin sister Taran, who instead of fighting her bullies chooses to adapt, because she believes that she'll never be able to win against the powerful. She believes that she'll be saved from her powerlessness if she marries the right guy. But even though the story doesn't encourage Taran at all, she is still a character with complex psychology and her own view of the world. She is not passive or docile, she is adamant on getting her life to be exactly the way she pictured it. And even though she makes some really bad choices, she has only herself to blame for them. Her weaknesses are human. Taran is wrong, but she clearly has agency in being wrong. Even though Jude is clearly portrayed as the one who is in the right, throughout the story I related to both sisters. And in fact, there were a lot of times when I related to Taran more. I was also bullied when I was in school, and do you think I stood up to my bullies? I didn't even know how. In fact, I remember there was one time when I got really angry and I wanted to kick the guy who was bullying me in the shins. But I didn't, because I was afraid of hurting him. I literally thought that I would break his leg or something if I kicked him, which is ridiculous. But in any case, I didn't want to hurt him back, even though he was tormenting me. I'm not sure if that makes me weak. When I think about it, if there was like a film with my life story, would I fall into the category of strong female character? No way! I can't fight. I don't think I've ever hurt another person. I'm rarely rude to people, and even though I'm getting better and better at expressing my anger, I'm nowhere near being constantly angry or sassy. It takes me ages to come up with a good comeback. I usually avoid confrontation unless it's really necessary. Does that make me weak or docile? Subverting gender roles is not enough when the ideas about femininity being inherently inferior remain unquestioned. It's not enough if it perpetuates the idea that women have no agency unless they learn how to fight, or that nonviolent behavior is a sign of weakness. Maybe there are other assumptions about women that strong female characters fail to challenge, and that's why we're not always satisfied with them. And it's not just about women really, but about power, and most importantly, powerlessness. The underlying assumption seems to be that those who don't have power, those who are oppressed by other people, are, well, docile and passive and weak, and are generally not even fully human because they are not willing to fight to get, well, power, to become empowered. We assume that the powerless don't have agency, We assume that being like a girl means being docile and weak. Maybe femininity is something more than a cage. We can appreciate the early feminist thought and its impact, but at the same time accept its limitations. Maybe there's something more to femininity. What if it's more than just a ruse of the patriarchy? What if it's more than doing nothing but wait, or being a passive victim, or being the hero's prize? Do oppressed people really lack agency? Why do we interpret their life experiences as meaningless, insignificant, and lacking self-discovery, self-development? Are there stories to be told from the point of view of the powerless, as Ursula Le Guin wanted to do? Anything else but the story of their suffering, of course. Or are they just props in the hero's journey, unless they learn to dominate and control others themselves? Chapter 3. The Powerless. So, who are the powerless that the hero saves? Who are all the people in the background of his grandiose journey, grateful for their salvation? Who are the marginalized, the weak and innocent, all those who stay behind, unable to go on journeys? Are they really powerless, useless, soon-to-be victims, or do they have their own heroic deeds, radically different in their motivation from the heroism of the hero? Does heroism require journeys in violence? Or is it just that other forms of agency, of resistance, for the longest time weren't considered worthy of being written down? Instead of fighting for a right to belong in a heroic narrative, we should question it. Because what if the hero didn't stand above all the non-heroes? What if all the people in the background waiting to be saved had agency, complex lives and personalities, their own dreams and ideas about the world? What if the powerless weren't just weak, helpless victims? What if they had agency? You see, it's a tricky question, especially for feminism, because if we assume that marginalized people lead full and complex lives despite being oppressed, then there is no need for change, right? For the longest time, people argued that women are just special, they have their own feminine happiness and their own feminine destiny, and they just happen to find this mysterious purpose in life when they are scrubbing the floors clean. They just happen to like sacrificing themselves for the sake of their families, because that's just womanly, that's just what women are. They are free to choose, but they all just happen to choose this mysterious path of domestic labor for some reason, because they are just different from men. So, of course, feminists argued that femininity and the idea of women being special, just different from men, was just a myth to keep women confined to those very restrictive life paths, and to persuade them that that's just what women's happiness is like. And as a feminist myself, it was something that bothered me, something that I always wondered about in my fascination with culture and history, and how human beings perceived themselves in different time periods and places. If I were born several centuries ago, back when women were considered property of men, does that mean that I would actually be less human, because I wouldn't have access to education and stuff, and therefore wouldn't be able to perceive myself correctly? Would I be complacent to the patriarchy? Would I be docile and brainwashed just because everyone around me believed that that's how things were supposed to be? John Stuart Mill, one of the earliest male proponents of gender equality, argued that women were basically enslaved beings, brainwashed by men into believing that their oppression is normal. As he put it, men have put everything in practice to enslave women's minds. The masters of all other slaves rely for maintaining obedience on fear. The masters of women wanted more than simple obedience, and they turned the whole force of education to effect that purpose. All women are brought up from the very earliest years in the belief that their ideal of character is the very opposite to that of men. Not self-will and government by self-control, but submission and yielding to the control of others. There's a theory that specifically explains how marginalized people supposedly convince themselves that the injustice they experience is normal and just the way things are supposed to be. It's called adaptive preference theory, or AP theory. It's the idea that people adjust their desires or preferences based on what they believe is possible or available to them, especially in challenging situations. Instead of wanting what might truly make them happiest or most fulfilled, they learn to settle for what they can realistically achieve. The concept of adaptive preferences has been particularly influential in feminist theory through the work of scholars like Martha Nussbaum, who theorized about how systematic oppression and social conditioning may shape women's desires and choices, and why women may appear to choose unequal or oppressive conditions. According to her, preferences might be deformed by ignorance, malice, injustice, and blind habit. So a woman who lives in an oppressive society just doesn't have conception of herself as someone who has been wronged, who has the right not to be abused, and to seek both employment and credit on a basis of equality with men. She argues that this awareness has to be taught to women because otherwise they wouldn't understand the unfairness of their situation. They don't understand that they are people, that their rights are violated. They have no sense that what's happening to them is wrong. For example, women in some countries choose to prepare more nutritious food for their husbands and less nutritious food for themselves, or choose to invest in their sons' education instead of their own, or accept very low-paying jobs. I personally know several women in Russia who have a salary of $200 a month, working 40 hours a week. So, according to AP theory, these women just don't understand that they deserve better, so they adjust their preferences accordingly. The problem, however, is that AP theorists primarily used examples of women from third world countries to show how they just don't seem to understand that they don't want to be abused or hurt, because that's what we need Western education for. And they also implied, or just outright said, that these women have no agency or rationality or self-respect, which gives the West the right to teach them those things, even against their wishes. As some critics argue, the idea of AP involves treating women who perpetuate their oppression as dupes of patriarchy or brainwashed, defective agents with bad values, incapable of self-reflection or pursuing their own needs and desires. Serene J. Carter, however, argues that it doesn't have to be this way. She says that it's possible to acknowledge that human beings who exist in situations of oppression might have adaptive preferences without actually denying marginalized people their agency or saying that they are simply brainwashed. She says that people who are oppressed are able to correctly judge their situation and that their choices might be rational, even if those choices end up perpetuating their oppression. She argues that oppressed people have a cognitive capacity to render accurate, non-normative judgments about their opportunities, but also complex moral psychology and ambivalent feelings about unjust norms that they live in. But because their options are limited, they might simultaneously do the best they can to advance their interests and perpetuate their oppression. Just because they are not in the position of power doesn't mean that they have no agency or their own opinion about their situation. Just because they don't rise up against sexist norms doesn't mean that they like those norms or that they are incapable of self-reflection. They are not defective agents. They are human beings and deserve to be treated with respect. If you want to learn more about AP theory, I suggest Olisanvi's excellent video on the topic. The reason I'm bringing it up in the first place is because it seems to be that the way we assume that oppressed people or just people who are not in the position of power have no agency, the way we treat women from ultra-patriarchal countries seems very similar to me to how we treat weak female characters. For example, there are a lot of people in the comments of my last video about villainesses who said how they prefer these villainous characters over weak and docile female protagonists of shoujo manga. This brings us us back to the question of damsels in distress that we are so adamant on critiquing. Why are we assuming them to be docile? Why do we assume that they lack complex personalities? Why do we assume that they have no opinion of their own, and if they do, it doesn't matter? Why do we deny them agency and assume that they are just passive? Maybe they aren't actually that passive. Maybe it's just that's how they are usually portrayed. Maybe they just haven't been given a voice. Tatar argues that when well-known tales and myths are told from the perspectives of women, the heroines there no longer seem so passive. This is one of the purposes of contemporary feminist retellings of those stories. We see that the heroines of these retellings all have rich inner lives, once they get a chance to tell their stories themselves. This way, their lives are memorialized and rescued from oblivion, because now they've been given a voice. And before, they didn't have one. In fact, for the longest time, women had been told that they shouldn't speak, as speech is something that only men have a right to. Samuel Johnson, an English writer, told his biographer Boswell, "Sir, a woman's preaching is like a dog's walking on his hind legs. It is not done well, but you are surprised to find it done at all." In the Odyssey, Telemachus tells Penelope, his mother, that speech will be the business of man, all men, and of me most of all. Heroines of many myths and tales were often silenced through violence of societal norms. Examples include the myth of Philomela, whose tongue was cut out because she wanted to speak up after she was sexually assaulted, and fairy tales where heroines were deprived of their voices or forced into passivity. These narratives reflect real-world mechanisms of silencing and show how power structures attempt to suppress women's voices. Because historically, speech was one of the few weapons that women could fight with. Even if they weren't taught how to read and write, they could talk and listen to each other, and above all, tell and retell stories. It's not a coincidence that in many languages, words about storytelling are linguistically linked to weaving in women's crafts. We weave plots, spin stories, fabricate tales, or tell yarns, a reminder of how the work of our hands produced social spaces that promoted the exchange of stories. First, perhaps in the form of chit-chat, gossip, and news, then in the shape of narratives and other dense golden nuggets of entertaining wisdom, passed down from one generation to the next. Because women were storytellers, they passed on stories to children and to each other, stories that we now know as fairy tales. But of course, fairy tales weren't only meant for children. They were a source of wisdom passed on from women to women, and many fairy tales were originally dark, darker than we know them to be today. They dealt with themes such as domestic violence, incest, and accounts of sexual assault. These stories were designed as cautionary tales. But even though fairy tales were told by women, unsurprisingly they were written down and published by men. As Tatar argues, some of these men, like Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, Joseph Jacobs, and others, tried to remove the darker content from the collections of fairy tales, partly because they thought some stories were too dark to be suitable for children, and partly because they just didn't like them. For example, Andrew Lang tried to adapt Donkey Skin to be more child-friendly. If you don't know, it's a story about a father lusting after his own daughter, and Lang tried to make him into an adopted father, cause that makes things better, you know? Other stories were ignored altogether, like tales about fathers who lock their daughters up in towers, chop off their hands or sell them to the devil. And then Disney, for some reason, preferred fairy tales with evil stepmothers and sorceresses over those with abusive fathers. So that's how stories about domestic abuse eventually disappeared from the fairy tale canon. But they were there, just as there were brave and fierce heroines who displayed model heroic behavior and fought against their abusers with resilience and courage. And a lot of the times they fought with words. In many fairy tales and myths, heroines used speech and storytelling strategically. In a lot of these stories, speech had the power to right wrongs. For example, even though Philomela's tongue was cut out and she was locked up, she still managed to tell the account of her sexual assault by weaving it into a cloth that was then delivered to Procne, her sister. In The Robber's Bridegroom from Grimm's Fairy Tales, the heroine tells her story by framing her narrative as a dream, thus defeating the robber. And of course, Scheherazade from 1001 Nights escapes her death by telling stories with cliffhangers so compelling that her tyrannical husband keeps her alive night after night, just to hear what happens next. By weaving her tales, Scheherazade not only saves her own life, but also gradually transforms Shahryar from a cruel despot into a thoughtful and just leader. Because speech and stories hold a power that can impact and transform others. Another power that the heroines of myths and tales possessed was that of endurance and resilience. In my last video, I argued that endurance is the gendered trait traditionally expected of women. Many heroines in popular culture are enduring good girl Cinderellas. However, there's obviously nothing wrong with endurance itself. Endurance doesn't mean a lack of agency. It can be obedience in disguise, shaped by values of self-control and devotion to duty as defined by a patriarchal order, as a form of quiet resignation and refusal to fight fate. Or it can be a form of resistance. You can endure hardships and suffer and do nothing about it, or you can endure to protect your principles and values, or bear it until you have a chance to act. Endurance in itself doesn't mean giving up on acting. It can be a strategy. Resilience, too, is a form of strength, of refusing to break no matter what. Being recklessly brave sure looks cool and probably feels empowering, or at least until your recklessness gets you killed. But is, for example, being rude and defiant with a tyrant such a smart move? I mean, I know that if I read this kind of scene in a book, the strong female protagonist there will probably only earn cookie points with the tyrant, who will be very impressed with her defiance and will probably also fall in love with her on top of that. But I know that in real life she'd be dead 2 seconds ago. Being defiant is not always smart, and a lot of heroines in myths and fairy tales were smart. Because I'm from Russia, I obviously grew up reading Russian fairy tales, and there were basically 2 types of characters in these fairy tales: a fool and a very smart girl, and they sometimes work in tandem against villains. They would typically feature a guy who is not smart or talented or anything really, but who is very kind to everybody. And then a downright brilliant girl whose hand in marriage the guy usually wins by being kind and gentle. So they make a perfect team. He is kind to literally every creature, and the creatures he helps usually turn out to be magical, so they help him back to repay his kindness. And she's just badass and smart and wise. She knows everything and she outwits every villain. Some tales feature only the smart girl. My favorite one is about Phineas the Falcon, because it basically has this girl. When her father asks her what she wants him to bring her as a present from his travels, she replies that she wants a feather of Phineas the Falcon, which everyone thinks is weird, because what would you need a feather for? But when her father brings her this feather, later in the evening she says some magic words, and what do you know? The feather turns into a hot guy, because she's a smart girl. The hot guy turns into a falcon during the day and then back into a man of flesh and blood during the night for her. The fairy tale doesn't elaborate on what they do at night, but long story short, they get separated, he falls under a spell of a sorceress, and then she goes on to travel 1,000 miles to find him and save him. And then there is also a Turkmen fairy tale about Guldahan, who tells her sisters that her dream is to marry the Padishah, so that he would take off his shoes when she leaves the room and then put them back on for her when she returns. The Padishah overhears this, finds her arrogance offensive, and throws her into the desert to die. But she survives, and on top of that builds her own freaking city right in the desert, many times cooler than the guy's city. She becomes the city's Padishah and the wisest, fairest, and most generous ruler on earth. That's the end, she just rules, she doesn't marry anyone. Because again, these tales were told by women to other women, and unsurprisingly they imagined women who were smarter than men, or women who refused to marry. For example, there's a story type that can be found in the tales of people of Chukotka and Kamchatka, and also in the tales of Eskimo people of American Greenland, about a woman who outright refused to marry. I wonder how these women knew to dream about a life where they didn't have to marry without Western education. Of course, in the stories told by women, their heroines were strong, resilient, and courageous. Because even in very patriarchal cultures, women weren't just passive victims with enslaved minds. They resisted by creating narratives about navigating social constraints, expressing agency, and forming solidarity. But these tales were forgotten, their heroines were unsung, unlike male-centric narratives that everyone agrees are extremely important and are somehow the key to human condition. As of now, 85% of Nobel laureates in literature are men. Women and their stories have never occupied a permanent place in the literary canon. George Eliot, a female writer, wrote an essay in 1856 titled Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, and we haven't really gotten much further since then. Best-selling female authors are still getting dragged through the mud without fail, because their works threaten to be the downfall of civilization and the end of us all. It's because women's speech has been historically discredited as mere gossip and all wives' tales, and stories told by women were belittled as silly fairy tales for children or sensationalist entertainment. But the women in the stories we told each other weren't weak. They were brave and smart and curious and inventive. Even if they weren't even considered fully human by man, even if society denied them of their power, they still managed to express agency and fight to get what they wanted. And most importantly, the way they did it was often radically different from men in those heroic tales. They managed to solve conflicts without resorting to violence or killing their enemies, although there were also tales of warrior maidens who fought like men. But there were stories about the bravery of those who held their communities together, those who created life instead of destroying it. We have been heroic all along, but we've forgotten about it, because our speech, our values of non-violence, our stories, all of it has been forgotten and discredited as silly. So, unsurprisingly, the conditions of fictional heroism have been set by men and their stories. And now we aspire to belong in these stories because we believe that they somehow describe the human condition that we have somehow been denied access to, that we should prove our humanity to them somehow. So we have agreed that traditionally female characters in stories are weak and docile, and that we should fight to break the mold, the stereotype of women being weak. We've sought to prove that we too can be heroes, that we can break free from the constraints of our feminine identity, and fighting stereotypes about what femininity is and about what women can do is important. But it's not enough when in the end we only end up praising characters who act like men. Sometimes we even end up celebrating the same toxic masculinity that we've been trying to fight this whole time. I think that what we need is to either expand or to completely rethink our understanding of heroism as something that doesn't necessarily involve violence or bloodshed or solitary journeys. Maybe heroism is driven by attentive care, by empathy and compassion, by willingness to act, but not necessarily hurt others. Or maybe heroism could mean integrity or refusal to go against principles. For example, we could consider refusal to fight or hurt anyone heroic. But for now, our understanding of heroism, of strength, is for some reason still tied to combat, even though we all probably agree that wars are bad, hurting others is wrong, and being angry all the time is probably childish. But we can't seem to imagine exciting stories without violence, or anti-heroism from fighting. And don't get me wrong, stories about lone heroes fighting bad guys are fun, of course they are, otherwise we wouldn't be so hooked on them. They are popular because they are fun, just as fictional violence as conflict is something that we will probably never get tired of. But we should also be able to imagine other stories, other forms of heroism, resolutions of conflicts that don't involve bloodshed. Fiction is a space where we can theoretically imagine anything. If we can't imagine peaceful resolutions of conflicts, it would mean that there is an imaginative gap of some sorts, a gap that probably spills into reality. Like, how can we imagine a world without wars if we can't even imagine fiction without bloodshed? Chapter 4. Heroism. Oh, forgive me, I've been talking for hours at this point, and I really need the tea to get through this last part. You can go and grab a cup as well. The heroic tale itself and the violence it usually involves, the exceptionality of the hero, all of it is just narrative convention, and it's a convention that can and should be questioned. It's just convention and not some mysterious universal truth about how the story of a single human being should be told. It's not necessarily harmful or problematic, but it's uncreative. It's entertaining, it's familiar, it's comforting, but we shouldn't default to it. The fact that some people have trouble even imagining stories outside of this convention means that there is an imagination gap. A gap that prevents us from thinking creatively about power, agency, and our ability to affect the world around us. The hero might start out as ordinary, but usually turns out to be exceptional, and people are usually okay with that, because we accept without questioning that some people are just better than others. And not just from the moral or ethical standpoint that good people are better than bad people, but also that powerful people are better than powerless people, because we assume that the powerful probably earned their power somehow. They deserve it. And the powerless are just too lazy or ordinary or unmotivated. The list goes on. We tend to accept this hierarchy as common sense. I had people in my comments argue that, of course, protagonists have to be powerful, otherwise they would be boring. And while I agree that powerful protagonists are fun, they are the necessary element of any power fantasy, and power fantasies are one of the most entertaining narratives. I love them, they're fun. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that protagonists who don't have power and are unwilling to seize it have to be boring. There is Laszlo Strange from Strange the Dreamer, who's not strong and can't fight, but he has this unique ability to dream. He's read basically the whole library of books, so because of that, he's able to affect the world around him with his knowledge and compassion. While the typical hero will probably always be fun no matter what their gender is, the world is not made of typical heroes. Heroic stories are not the only type of narrative that can move us. I don't know if you can hear my cat in the background. It's midnight, so naturally she's very active now. So we need stories that question whether the quest for power is universal to human condition, whether we need to become powerful for our life to have meaning. And we need stories that imagine non-violent resolutions of conflict. And I think there are a lot of stories like that in female-oriented media, which is why I love to talk about them. For some reason, they are generally considered to be stupid, silly, or just not serious enough, but I think they are special. There are things to be learned from them. There are a lot of protagonists written by women who resolve conflicts without resorting to violence, or at least without resorting to violence all the time. For example, Rishi from Sabbath Loop literally solves all conflicts by empathizing with people and talking them out of violent acts and wars. That's why my problem is not with the strong female character trope itself, but rather with the distinction that it implies, with the position of strong versus weak, especially when it's closely tied to violence and the ability to hurt others. Maybe we could rethink what strength means and untie it from combat and use it in a more neutral way as just being good at something, being competent. Or maybe we can use this word to denote admirable qualities. Or maybe strength is the ability to face challenges with grace, or the ability to withstand pressure. Like in fight scenes, the strongest character is often the one who overcomes themselves, who keeps going despite fear and uncertainty and rises to the challenge. But of course, combat isn't and shouldn't be the only fictional form of challenge, and therefore fighting abilities shouldn't be the only thing that marks a character as strong. For example, maybe an even more difficult challenge than fighting against a difficult opponent might be the challenge of accepting that you've been wrong about something. The challenge of your own crisis of belief, of your whole view of the world crumbling down. For example, Yona from Yona of the Dawn has lived her whole life as a sheltered princess, until she is betrayed by a person she loves, who kills her father and forces her into exile. Her whole world comes crumbling down, and she is forced to become strong in several ways. For example, she learns how to use a bow and protect herself. But that's not the only way in which she becomes strong. To me, the most admirable thing about Yona is that she doesn't choose revenge, as you might expect from a protagonist who has been wronged. She chooses to face the fact that maybe there were things that she didn't know and didn't understand about her own country. She realizes that while her father was kind, he wasn't a good ruler, and the person who led the coup is a much better leader who actually sees that their country is on the brink of invasion, something that her father ignored. She chooses to accept the fact that there is a whole world beyond her personal tragedy of being betrayed and exiled. And even though she eventually acquires the power to take back her kingdom, if she wanted, she chooses to use that power to protect her country from the sidelines, instead of orchestrating another coup that would kill thousands of people just to take back what in fact was stolen from her. She chooses wisdom and understanding of power, glory, and bloodshed. And in my eyes, that makes her one of the strongest protagonists I've ever encountered. Another example would be Inesh from Six of Crows, who is a deadly assassin with an incredibly strong moral compass. She navigates the world of thieves and criminals with a clear sense of right and wrong, trying to reconcile her violent skills with her moral beliefs. And she dreams of eventually using those skills to hunt slavers instead of serving criminals. Her quiet strength lies not in just what she is capable of doing, but in what she chooses to stand for, and in her integrity and unshakable resilience. For her, agency, freedom is not just a physical state, a capability, but an existential one. She, who was once kidnapped and sold into a pleasure house, fights to reclaim control over her body, her identity, and her destiny. There are many female protagonists whose strength doesn't come from their ability to beat people up. There are characters like Nina from Nina the Starry Bride and Yona from Concubine's Walkthrough, who are unflinching in their resolve to solve conflicts peacefully and avoid bloodshed. Then there is Brianna from Legendborn, who, like a fairy tale heroine, defeats her opponents with the power of words. She has a silver tongue that makes people have a sudden urge to tear it out, because she exposes truths they'd rather ignore, skillfully pointing out their insecurities and the roots of their hostility and bigotry. Mao Mao from the Apothecary Diaries is another example. She is incredibly smart, comes off as cool and indifferent, but is far more compassionate than she lets on. Her sharp curiosity and thirst for knowledge end up transforming and saving the lives of those around her. Then there is the protagonist from A Thousand Nights, who doesn't even have a name, perhaps to show how special she is, that she could be one of the many women whose names were forgotten by history. She is thrust into a position of vulnerability. It's 1001 Nights retelling, and she offers herself as a bride to a tyrant instead of her sister. But despite being powerless, she retains her agency, subtly influencing those around her and challenging the oppressive forces she faces. She draws strength from her intelligence and resilience, but also from her bond with her sister and her community. In the end, it's their prayers that empower her to defeat the darkness. Then there is Laia from An Ember in the Ashes, who starts off as timid and afraid, but her grief, empathy, and sense of justice set her apart in a world built on cruelty and oppression. She infiltrates a military academy as a maid to save her brother, and her journey is anything but easy. Her strength isn't innate, it's something she builds over time. Her story is about facing fear, embracing vulnerability, and discovering the power within it. While the more typical hero-like, strong or fighting female characters feel inspiring and empowering because they remind me that I have a right to fight back and to stand for what I care about instead of just enduring it. The protagonists who embody a different kind of strength, quiet yet formidable, are also incredibly inspiring and empowering, because they remind me that I don't need to be rude or angry or hurt other people to affect the world around me. They remind me that maybe we are actually fine the way we are. We should make space for different kinds of heroism, the kinds of strength that are not masculine coded, and these strengths include wisdom, resilience, empathy and kindness, resistance and integrity. I think heroes and heroines should be human, not superhuman. Superhuman characters are often so perfect that they lack personality. And there's actually a reason for that. The heroes of those heroic myths kind of had to be one-dimensional because that's what made them into a symbol, and their story easy to be told and retold. Those heroic archetypes come from a time when the spoken word was the only means of transmission. Heroes had to be larger than life, with stereotypical traits that made it easier to learn their stories by heart. They had to be badass instead of human. But being human means being weak and vulnerable. It's about connecting with others, learning to accept help, and realizing that you don't have to do everything alone, no matter how cool that might seem. Forming alliances and relying on others is completely normal. The lone hero on a grand journey shouldn't be the default storyline, and we shouldn't try to model all human experiences after it. In reality, none of us are lone heroes, and the world can't be saved by just one person. That's why, for me, truly admirable characters are the ones who check in with others, who can act alone but sometimes choose not to. They have integrity and courage. They stand by their values. They empathize with others but know how to set boundaries on their empathy. And they aren't born heroic or effortlessly cool. They learn and grow as their story unfolds. None of these traits are inherently gendered. Sure, kindness, gentleness, and empathy are often feminine-coded, but male characters should embody them too. And while kindness and empathy can be used against us, that doesn't mean we should let them go. We shouldn't equate them with docility or weakness. Being kind isn't weak, being vulnerable isn't weak, and actually being weak is fine, it's just part of being human. What matters is how we face and overcome those weaknesses. Of course it's fine if female characters adopt masculine-coded traits, but at this point maybe it's time for a different kind of subversion. We need to challenge other gender roles. I think it's men who should accept their feminine traits, because femininity is not a weakness. I know from some of my male friends that back when they were kids, to them, being compared to a girl was the worst kind of insult. And to this day, there are people who lament that men are becoming more feminine. And I know that transgressions of gender norms always make people uncomfortable. Perhaps that is to be expected. But in the case of people's disdain for a feminist man, that's not the only cause. It's because femininity is still seen as something inferior, as if it's degrading. And that, I think, is the real problem. Thanks to feminism, we women are slowly but surely getting out of the cage that femininity once was. Just imagine, less than 100 years ago, most people thought that the idea that women might not always want to be mothers and wives to be just insane. Now, feminism has become a part of our cultural code. We can now examine our former cage, poke at it with sticks, we can take a look at it from the outside. But because masculinity is considered to be a much cooler, shinier cage, women rising to the level of men were eventually celebrated, because people agreed that being like men is a lot better than being like girls. But for men, it's not like that, because femininity is considered to be something degrading. They are not encouraged to get out of their cage, they want to fit into their cage with all the other cool kids, because everyone outside the cage are losers, those who are like girls. They police themselves, they police each other, they mold themselves into the kind of animal that would be happy and content inside the cage, and they tell themselves that that's how it's supposed to be. Of course, I obviously can't speak on behalf of men, but at least that's what it seems like to me from the outside. I think it's at least in part because we still equate femininity with docility and weakness. And I think that none of us will ever be truly free until we stop doing so. Thank you for listening.